Hey, welcome to Main Pod Girl, a podcast made by Popheads for Popheads. I'm your host, AJ Marks. Today, we're really switching things up here on Main Pod Girl because for as long as the show has been going, this is the first presidential election since we began. It's important to me and the rest of the Pophead staff to encourage any American listening to this episode to register to vote. With 8 million 18 to 19-year-olds eligible to vote for the first time this year, and nearly half of 18 to 24-year-olds that are not currently registered to vote, Gen Z represents a significant demographic that could greatly affect laws and policies across this country. So joining me today is Lucille Wenegieme, the Executive Director of HeadCount, which is the leading nonpartisan organization focused on youth voter registration through celebrity activations. HeadCount has registered nearly 1.3 million voters through partnerships with artists like Ariana Grande, Sabrina Carpenter, Demi Lovato, and Cardi B. And for that, we are so grateful. Lucille, how are we doing on this fine day?
I'm doing great. I'm living the life, and I am excited to see that you have not one, not two, but three different Mileys in your background for the visual. Y'all are missing out for just the audio, but
Miley comes through with the vote, and she has it in the past, and I just thought it was appropriate.
Love it.
Let's start off this conversation with the impact of celebrity endorsements. Some people might be skeptical that pop stars can have a tangible impact on the election. What have been some moments during this election cycle where you've seen evidence against that assumption?
Yeah, I think there are two sort of big moments in my mind that I'm thinking of. The first is Taylor Swift urging people to get their voter registration either up to date or to register if they weren't already. And she drove over 300,000 visits to the National Voter Registration website. And then, of course, Charlie XCX, and, making it a bright summer, letting folks know where she stood in general and in the political discourse in the way that only I think pop girlies know how, which is totally culturally relevant, really fun, kind of tongue in cheek. I think we're talking about it all summer, and it's October and we're still talking about it. So yes. I think that's also part of the impact, is being able to take something that's culturally relevant from a political sense or from a civic sense and make it culturally relevant more broadly and really kind of launching it into the zeitgeist.
Yeah, Charlie isn't even American.
Yeah, which is another thing that we get asked a lot. We've had partners like Harry Styles who aren't American. And I mean, they live here oftentimes, they work here a lot. And so they're also invested in America being the place that, we all want it to be. So it totally makes sense.
Yeah, I don't think it's that far-fetched to want a country to be better, even if it's not your home country. It was so interesting how Taylor Swift chose to endorse Kamala Harris directly following the presidential debate. Do you believe the timing was right on her part, considering that before that, Donald Trump claimed that he had the endorsement of Swifties?
Yeah, I think there's probably a couple of things to think about when it comes to the timing, right? It's that first piece of having your likeness sort of used outside of what you would want it to be used for, having, a candidate say that you support them or their, ideas and ideals. And I think setting that record straight. And I think for folks in the music space in particular, figuring out what to do with their likeness can be really difficult. There are a million different decisions about, do I want my face next to that thing? Do I want my audio, in the background of this commercial? I think especially for women in music, I think especially women in pop music, it's that thought of if I tell people they can't do that, am I going to come off badly? Or is that going to be understood as a way to protect myself or to have, my image be used in the way that I want? And so I think that was probably in some of that calculation on the timing. Right after one of the most watched debates and, probably recent history is probably a great time if what you're trying to do is have a cultural touch point or, make a larger conversation. But one thing that, especially at HeadCount, because we work with, so many artists, so much talent, even outside of music, is really working with them to find that right time. And when does it feel right for you to talk about something? Does it feel right before the debates even start? Does it feel right before the conventions? Does it feel right when it seems pretty clear who the candidates are going to be on the ballot? Maybe you actually want to talk more about the issues than about any particular candidate. And so I think every artist, the same way every person, is thinking about, how important is this to me? How much do I want to say about it? How publicly do I want to say it? At the end of the day, artists are people too. And so I think that there's a lot going into that decision.
Totally. Speaking of timing, right after Harris started her official campaign for president, I think that's when Charlie XCX tweeted out Kamala is Brat. And Kamala's campaign leaning into the Brat themed branding and the use of like Chappell Roan songs like Femininomenon on TikTok, that all really felt like a huge initial push and really, really great timing on Charlie's part, but also for Vice President Harris's campaign. It really turned that campaign into a pop culture led campaign in a way that felt a lot more successful than previous ones, where the attention to the youth vote felt a little, well, I'll just say less natural. I'll never forget Pokemon Go to the polls.
RIP to that one.
RIP.
I totally understand what you mean. And it's been really interesting to see for organizations like HeadCount, where we're constantly talking to young voters, not just in a presidential year, but, in a year where there's a tiny local election, where we're talking to music fans and to young voters. That's definitely one of the things that we hear is like, oh yeah, I heard that somebody, started this campaign or did this thing, and it was very clear that they were trying to talk to young people. I think try is really that kind of operative word. And I think young people in particular, like they're savvy. Like young people know when you're just trying to like put on, when you're like Google searching who's the most famous artist right now, or like which song is popular among the 18 to 29-year-olds. Like young people know that, right? And so I think part of that too, when we're looking at the campaigns, is how they're staffing. We've seen trends in the campaigns of staffing younger folks, particularly folks that are going to be moving digital campaigns and digital efforts. And so I think that's really reflected the natural outreach to young people. And, for our part at HeadCount, we're nonpartisan, but it's really great to see not just, other organizations, but campaigns really hone in on young people as not just an afterthought. And I think it's also really important to think about what that broader landscape is. Candidates are often thinking about, how do I get the number of people that I need to get to win this race to have the outcome that I want. And at places like HeadCount, we're really thinking about how do we get as many young people, as many music fans all across the country to have their voice heard, not just to like have a particular outcome in a particular election. And so through that lens, there's always room to talk to young people. Young people are always the target demographic where there might not be until an afterthought for a campaign. But it was really cool to see the summer kind of really dominated. And I think that also was reflected in like the memes too.
Yep.
Young people are like, okay, yes, bet we can roll with this and iterate on it and have it again, like feel really organic and user generated in a way that like a user tested campaign is just never going to hit.
Totally. Before she even started her campaign, there was that coconut tree meme, which I think was originally used against her, but really backfired and got everyone on side with Kamala in the days when people were expecting Joe to step down. But you mentioned local elections. What are some examples of important issues that are being put to a vote in this election on the local and state levels?
Yeah, so all across the country, there are a variety of things, both in the issue space as well as local positions. So that's everything from congressional candidates. In some places, people will be voting on their judges. In some places, they'll be voting on referendums around reproductive choice and access. Some folks will have referendums locally and regionally statewide around climate change measures. So there are a variety of things based off of where you live. Some of that is statewide, some of that is more local, like your county races, but oftentimes those will all be on a collective ballot that you get in November. So I really invite folks to go to headcount.org/whatever state they're from to get a sense of what their dates are, what they'll need to hit the ballot, but also they can see a sample ballot so that they can do some research ahead of time. What a lot of folks don't know is in most states across the country, you can vote early too, which is really great if you're trying to figure out how you're going to make it with your class schedule, or if it's just easier on a weekend or whatever day you have access to, a car or something like that. So you have some flexibility there, but yeah, definitely make sure you're as informed as possible. I always tell people there are no wrong answers because I think sometimes people get a little bit of anxiety of like having to make the right choice. And I also remind people like the more you vote, the less pressure every single vote feels like, right? I think there's a tendency to talk about like presidential elections as being like the election, the like Mac Daddy of all elections. And like to a certain extent, that's true. But, if you're somebody who's voting in midterms, if you're voting in your local elections, you have a habit and a practice of being able to say, oh yeah, I know about that referendum. I know how it worked. I know who ran it. Or, oh yeah, like other states do this, but our state does this. And especially for young people, because young people move so much. On average, young folks will move once every 18 months. And sometimes those are across states, and folks will, move to a specific city and not know, what a state position on something is that's really important to them. So I always encourage folks like, yeah, do a little research. We can help you with that. And we can, let you know what to expect so that once you get to the ballot box, you can make whatever choice feels right for you.
That was a great point about moving to different states. That's something that I should probably get a little bit more brushed up on myself. But I love that you brought up early elections, because it has definitely helped me in a couple elections, making sure that I just get my vote in. I know that I've done it. It helps everyone who's voting on the official day to not have to worry about longer lines and things like that. So it definitely does help speed the process along. And also, I just wanted to say, I know in my home state of Massachusetts, voting no on question 5 is very important to me and all of my friends who work in restaurants, because even though it might seem positive to raise the wages of servers, there are a lot of other complications that could come with it. So it would really ruin the restaurant industry, in my opinion. So I strongly urge everyone to read the government-issued voting booklets ahead of time and to talk about these questions with your friends. I want to encourage conversation with the people that you really trust around these things, because being informed is so important, and seeing something on a ballot might not give it the whole picture.
Yeah. And I think it's really important to connect even with what we were talking about with, folks like Taylor or Charlie or other folks kind of getting into the conversation is like, yeah, sometimes it does, take somebody that's really high profile to like pierce the group chat, right? Like I might not want to be the person in my group chat to be like, hi, how do we feel about Amendment Z? But it starts a conversation. So we're like, oh, like, did you see that post? Like the memes have been crazy. Like, what do you guys think? Like, have you guys picked up? Like, it provides a more organic, sort of fodder for those kinds of conversations. Because I completely agree that it is about all of us and being able to get additional points of information. How does it affect, this group of people versus this group of people? And especially with the folks that we talk to a lot at, concerts or music festivals or community events, we talk about voting as being part of a larger like civic menu, right? Like we are not going to be the people that say voting is the only thing you could do. Voting's going to, change the world. It's a beat all end all. It's one of a variety of things that includes talking to people in your life about what's important. Young people will often do things like mutual aid, right? Like really directly helping somebody in their community that has a face and a name that they can connect with. Sometimes it looks like volunteering. Sometimes it looks like running for office. And that doesn't even always have to be with a party. There are tons of nonpartisan offices across the country. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, like conversation, I think, is the core. And, it's how you drive any of this stuff.
Totally. So getting into a different topic, an Axios poll from February found that 58% of voters 18 to 35 may sit out on the general election because the two major party options were Biden and Trump. Now, with Harris in the picture and less than a month away from the election, have you seen a sizable impact on registration numbers?
Definitely. After the candidate switch, which feels like ages ago, but was just a couple months, we definitely saw a bump. And some of that can just be like, oh, there's news, right? There's people talking about it. It was something new and interesting. But it really reflected something that we heard in a lot of our conversations over the past probably 6 to 8 months, which is that young people were really looking for a different set of choices, a different set of options. And I would say that young voters were probably the most consistently vocal about that, wanting to see something different. And so within a very short span of time, there was a new presidential candidate on the Democratic side, and both sides had named vice presidential candidates. And so all of a sudden, there was like sort of a new cast of characters across sort of the top of the ticket. And that definitely did drive some energy. That being said, in the weeks since then, what we do know, comparing sort of 2024 numbers to, I should say, reported numbers so far for 2024 versus 22 and 20, is that there is still a decline. So, as young people are getting older and kind of joining other age groups, and the youngest of voters are becoming a little bit older, making sure they're all registered and they have what they need. We're a little bit behind pace nationally on that. So that's another place where if you still have time wherever you live, some of the deadlines have already passed. I believe Georgia had their deadline on Monday, October 7th for this November election. Make sure that you're registered. If you know for sure that you're registered, I would also still recommend that you check your registration status at your current address. Again, lots of folks move and they might be registered to vote in an old place, especially if you're somebody who intends to vote by mail, because they'll mail you the ballot wherever they have your address to. So you don't want it going to the wrong place. But yeah, it's definitely one of those where we want to make sure that young people have what they need and to turn out. Another thing, too, is that 2020, most people don't know this, was the highest voter registration for young people ever and the highest voter turnout for young people ever. So, we really have that kind of like record legacy to look back to, which is amazing, but also a little bit daunting. It's like, can we get another record amount of young people to get engaged and get in the game? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe the candidates will, prove themselves to be compelling. Maybe the issues on the ballot will, prove themselves to be compelling. And then, for HeadCount's part, we're trying to turn out the over 2 million people in our network and make sure that they have what they need and they make it across the finish line.
It's just reported numbers, right? Some states don't have official reports on these, but 8 states have more young people registered now than in 2020. Nevada, Massachusetts, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Michigan, Kansas, West Virginia, and Texas. 2 of those, Michigan and Nevada, are swing states that are very important. Where else are young people poised to have major impact in this election?
I think there are a variety of places where young people in particular can have some outsized impact, and that tends to be related to where there are issues on the ballot. Mm-hmm. Similarly to when we were talking about kind of the candidate question, when we're talking about swing states or battleground states, oftentimes those are about electoral votes. And that's, generally in the presidential context, but there's so many things down ballot where when we're talking about the impact of young people, even as recently as the conversation in Nebraska about how the electors are able to allocate their ballots and things like that. Those are places where when we're looking at statewide initiatives or local initiatives where young people can be especially impactful. So I would definitely remind folks, like, not just the top of the ticket. Like, there are places where referendums are passing, by 100, 200, 1,000 votes. And those are places where particularly young voters can have an outsized impact. I also remind people, you don't have to vote for every single thing that's on your ballot. If there's something that you absolutely don't feel comfortable with, you can skip that like particular line item, race, question. And that's also for us. We run a national program. So we don't just think that battleground states are the only ones that matter. We care that, folks in Idaho get to have their voice heard in their local government, that folks in Rhode Island, if they, not places that we would think of as necessarily deciding presidential elections, but where a lot of the local things that will sometimes end up as national measures get tested. Sometimes we'll hear a lot about a national initiative that comes up in Congress. And usually it's because one state somewhere already tried it and had some sort of outcome that people in Congress want to emulate. And so sometimes your state could be a petri dish for something that either works or doesn't work. And we've seen that play out in a variety of ways. We have presidential candidates, vice presidential candidates talking about things in their specific state and how that reflects nationally too. So yeah, it's all part of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Lucille, for joining me. I really appreciated this chat.
It was so lovely to be on. Thank you so much. Great, thoughtful question.
Thank you so much. I also, for anyone listening to this episode, will be including helpful links to how you can register to vote, where you can see the registration deadlines, and yeah. Thank you so much, Lucille, for joining me, and thank you to Noah for the theme music. Make sure to rate and review us on whatever podcast platform you're listening to us on right now, and please go register to vote. See ya.